In this presentation, I wanted to talk to you about the rotator cuff and why your shoulder might be pinching or causing you a problem that can radiate down the arm, particularly noticeable when you lift your arm to about 90 degrees. So one of the more common things that we see in clinic is this shoulder pain. Shoulder pain when somebody is reaching their arms out towards 90 degrees. So why does this happen? How can you identify and carry out some tests to see if this is a problem for you? And most importantly, what do you do to prevent it? That's what we're going to talk about. So firstly, what we tend to find is that people may have been diagnosed or be familiar with this term rotator cuff. But when we ask them in clinic, what do you understand the rotator cuff to be? That's something that they're not too sure about. So what I wanted to do was be perfectly clear about what the rotator cuff is. Now, the rotator cuff is the collective name for four muscles who are tasked with giving stability and strength to our shoulder joint. So let's talk about the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint is what we call a ball and socket joint. It's a ball at the top of our upper arm joining into the socket of the shoulder blade. Now, what's good about this joint? Well, this type of joint, being the ball and socket, allows us the most amount of movement. We can move our shoulder joint into all sorts of planes of motion, so we get a lot of movement out of it. What's not so good about the shoulder joint is that it doesn't give us too much stability as a joint because of this movement. And that's why it's very common for shoulders to dislocate, or what we call sublux as well. Now, the rotator cuff, as I mentioned, is tasked with giving stability to this joint. And we have four muscles, two at the back of the shoulder, one on the top of the shoulder, and one underneath our chest muscle, that's role is to stabilize this shoulder joint. But what can happen is that we typically develop dysfunction in this area. Now, what we have is we have a space in the shoulder joint where lots of things pass through, including a lot of the tendons of this rotator cuff and some blood vessels and nerves. Now, if we get a problem in any of these muscles, what can happen is that we get an inflammation or a thickening of the tendons. And what that does is that it then closes up this space. And if you look at this shoulder joint here, as I start to move the arm away, we close that space. And what happens is once we get to 90 degrees, that is the classic kind of pinch point, or where we may get a problem in the shoulder joint. And this can create a referral pain typically down the arm. So how do we identify this? Well, one of the things that we might look to do is look at the mobility of the shoulder. How can you do that? Well, one of the tests we like to do is we like to ask somebody to reach behind their back. So if you look at me here, if I reach behind my back, I'm looking at the amount of rotation I've got in terms of internal rotation and then external rotation. And then we look to do the same on the other side, and what we're looking to do is compare left to right. Now, if you notice in your problematic side that that's a much more difficult movement, that straight away is an indication. If it's this movement, it means that we might be having an issue at the back of the shoulder, a restriction in the back of the shoulder. And it's very common that although the pain is here or running down the arm, it's important that we check out the whole of the musculature, that we really analyze those four different muscles to be making sure that there's no dysfunction in there. It's typical that we might be working with somebody in clinic in and around these areas, which actually releases a lot of their pain here. So that's one thing that you can be looking to do to improve. Now, so if you find out that you're tight in those areas and you found that doing some of this testing you're restricted, what can you do about it? Well, one of our favorite stretches to do around the shoulder is what we call the towel dry stretch. Now, works very well with towel, hence the name. I've got a stick here that I can use, but what you can simply do, if I was looking to stretch my right arm and improve this restriction that I've got reaching up my spine, which is the more common way we see a restriction, to be reaching up the spine, but we take a towel into our left hand and chuck it over our shoulder. Now, what you can then do is grab the bottom of that towel wherever the arm can get to. And that's why I like a towel, because it will come all the way down and you can grab at any point. Now, in order to get a stretch onto the back of the right shoulder, what I look to do is pull from the top here with my left hand. I look to just pull up and feel that stretch all through the back of the shoulder. I look to hold that for 30 seconds. What I can then do is stretch going in the opposite way to get a nice stretch on the left shoulder. So now I pull down from the right hand side. And then what I would simply do is just change that onto the other side and repeat that to get a nice full mobility stretching session onto the back of that shoulder. Now, I mentioned the rotator cuff. also has a big important role to play in terms of the stability of the shoulder. It gives the stability. So what we tend to see is some exercises, and you may have been given certain exercises to improve the rotator cuff, and they might be things like working in this direction or bringing the arm in and out or up and down, and these all work very well at targeting the rotator cuff muscles. But what we also like to do is to check the stability of the shoulder. So a simple way of doing this, and what we tend to find develops a lot of dysfunction in people with shoulder pain, is if you take yourself into something like the high plank position. So this is just the top of the press up position. And what we simply look to do is then take one hand to touch the other hand. Now, you can start by doing this in standing if that's something that's going to be difficult for you. So you can see I'm simply placing my hands on the wall here. And what I'm looking to do is then just reach one hand, touch the other hand, come back, and move the other hand. Now, if I think that my problem is in my right hand side, when I move my right hand, that should be okay. But if when I move my left hand, I notice either a weakness or a pain, that's showing me that I have an issue in those rotator cuff stabilizing muscles. So if we identify that to be a problem, then it's really important that we're not just working our arm into the mobility side of things, but we're also looking to build out a stability program to really make sure we're getting rid of this. My final tip for improving things around the rotator cuff is some form of sort of self-massage. If you can't be getting hands-on massage, using something like a lacrosse ball, a hockey ball, and placing that into the back of the shoulder and placing yourself up against the wall and rolling through there can also be a really handy technique in order to relieve that shoulder pain. But if you are someone who's suffering with shoulder pain, or you've noticed this pinch point and it's something that you want to be addressing, check out your movements. As I say, we've taken the arm up and taking the arm down the spine. Compare it left to right and start to analyze if you have an issue. And as ever, if you're somebody who's finding this to be an issue, drop a note into the comments, let us know, and we'll happily come back and discuss that with you. But it's something that we find that if we can get on top of that quite quickly, it will stop it becoming a bigger problem further down the line. So as ever, with any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me and ask away. We'll happily chat to you about it. But I thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope it's been informative and helpful for you. But we happily take any questions, any thoughts you have, any comments are always gratefully received. Thank you.